In 2015, Ford was in mourning. The GT500 with 662 horsepower had died the year before. Dodge saw the vacuum and unleashed the Hellcat with 707 horsepower, a brute that didn't know the meaning of the word corner. But GM decided to play a different game. Instead of more horsepower, more technology. Instead of beating Mustangs and Challengers, the goal was to humiliate Porsche and Ferrari. The result? The Corvette C7 Z06, 650 horsepower, supercar chassis, muscle car price, and a fatal flaw that nobody saw coming. Let me paint you a picture of 2015. The American performance war was at its most intense in decades. Dodge had just detonated the Hellcat with 707 horsepower, a number so absurd it made insurance companies have nightmares. Ford was rebuilding after killing the Shelby GT500. And GM looked at this chaos and thought, you know what? Let's go hunt some Germans. While Dodge was winning drag strip bragging rights and Ford was licking its wounds, GM executives made a decision that was either genius or completely insane. Instead of joining the horsepower war against domestic rivals, they pointed the Corvette at Stuttgart and Maranello. Yes, GM decided that a $79,000 American sports car should compete with Porsches costing $130,000 and Ferraris approaching $300,000. Executives were apparently very sober, or very drunk. History would prove it was a bit of both. Now, some of you might be thinking, but GM already had the Camaro ZL1 with 580 horsepower. And you're right, but 580 horses don't humiliate Ferrari. The Z06 wasn't built to upgrade the ZL1. It was a declaration of war against the entire European sports car establishment. This wasn't about being faster than a Mustang on Woodward Avenue. This was about destroying Porsches at the Nürburgring. The heart of this European hunting missile was the LT4, a 6.2-liter supercharged V8 that produced 650 horsepower and 650 pound-feet of torque, 650 and 650. Those numbers weren't accidents. GM engineers literally engineered symmetry into the spec sheet. This was the most powerful production Corvette ever built at that time, and GM wanted you to remember those numbers. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn. To achieve 650 horsepower, GM needed a massive supercharger, the Eaton R1740 TVS unit with 1.7 liters of displacement. This thing spins at up to 20,000 RPM, 20,000 revolutions per minute. Your car's engine redlines at maybe 6,000 or 7,000. This supercharger was spinning 3 times faster than that. And all that spinning creates one thing: heat. Lots and lots of heat. Now, why didn't GM just give the supercharger more room to breathe? Because GM wanted that sleek, low hood for aerodynamics and to meet global pedestrian safety regulations. The C7 was designed to be sold worldwide, and that meant the hood couldn't be too tall. European rules require space for pedestrian head impact protection. So GM engineered a compact 1.7-liter supercharger spinning at 20,000 RPM to fit under a hood designed for both speed and safety compliance. Want proof? The C7 ZR1 with its bigger supercharger couldn't even be sold in Europe. The hood was too tall. What could possibly go wrong? Let that satisfying irony sink in for a moment. GM built a 650 horsepower weapon designed to humiliate European supercars, but had to compromise its cooling to meet the same regulations that let them sell it in Europe. GM wanted global sales, and global sales meant a compact supercharger in a tight engine bay. The very market they wanted to conquer dictated the engineering that would become their Achilles heel. I'm not saying it was poetic justice, but I'm also not saying it. Let's talk about what made this thing tick. The LT4 used a Gen 5 small block architecture with an aluminum block, 10.0 to 1 compression ratio, and that intercooled supercharger producing roughly 9.4 psi of boost. The supercharger used a 4-lobe roots type design with a liquid-to-air intercooler integrated directly into the supercharger housing. In normal human speak, GM packed an insane amount of technology into a very tight space. Buyers had 2 transmission choices: the Tremec TR6077 speed manual or the GM 8L 98 speed automatic. The manual gave you 3.2 seconds to 60 miles per hour. The automatic? 2.95 seconds. Under 3 seconds. In 2015. For $79,000. A Ferrari 458 doing the same sprint cost $300,000. GM was essentially committing financial grand theft against European bank accounts. The numbers were absolutely obscene. 0 to 60 in 2.95 seconds with the automatic. Quarter mile in 10.95 seconds at 127 miles per hour. Top speed of 195 without the aero package. And lateral grip of 1.2 Gs, 1.2. Most sports cars struggle to hit 1 G. The Z06 was pulling 20% more than that. This wasn't a car. It was a physics experiment with license plates. The secret weapon wasn't just the engine. It was the C7's aluminum space frame chassis. This thing weighed roughly 3,500 pounds while being incredibly rigid. GM borrowed racing technology and put it in a car you could buy at your local Chevy dealer between a Silverado and a Malibu. The same dealership selling work trucks was also selling a legitimate track weapon. America, ladies and gentlemen. Here's a delicious piece of irony. The Z06 used magnetic ride control. This technology was originally developed by Delphi, which was a GM company. Ferrari later licensed this technology for their supercars. So technically, when Ferrari owners brag about their advanced suspension, they're bragging about GM technology. But here's the ultimate insult to Europe. Underneath that advanced magnetic damping, the Corvette was still using transverse composite leaf springs. Yes, GM was pulling 1.2 Gs and out-cornering Ferraris using suspension geometry traditionally associated with pickup trucks and horse carriages. The MagneRide handled the damping while Grandpa's leaf springs handled the weight. Let that sink in. If you're enjoying watching GM absolutely violate European price-to-performance ratios, smash that subscribe button. We've got the complete story of the Hellcat that started this war, the GT500 that died and came back, and every muscle car battle Detroit has ever fought. Now back to GM's European safari. For buyers who thought 650 horsepower wasn't enough chaos, GM offered the Z07 package for an additional $7,995. This added carbon ceramic Brembo brakes, Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 semi-slick tires, and an aggressive aerodynamics package. The Z07 package transformed the Z06 from very fast to, are you sure this is street legal? Those Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tires deserve special mention. These were legal semi-slicks, tires that technically met road requirements but were really designed for track use. They provided insane grip in dry conditions but became terrifying in the rain. Driving a Z06, Z07 in the rain was like ice skating with a rocket strapped to your back. Exhilarating and potentially fatal. Let's talk about value, because this is where GM committed financial crimes against European automakers. The Z06 started at $78,995, a Porsche 911 GT3, $131,400, the GT3 RS, $176,895, a Ferrari 458 Speciale, approaching $300,000. The Z06 cost 55% less than a GT3 RS while matching or beating its performance. Germany was furious. GM didn't just claim the Z06 could compete with Europeans, they proved it. At the Nurburgring, a Z06 with the manual transmission ran a 7-minute 13.9-second lap time according to Sport Auto magazine. The Porsche 911 GT3 RS of that same era. In the hands of the exact same magazine, same test conditions. Around 7 minutes 28 seconds. The American beat the German on German soil by roughly 14 seconds in an apples-to-apples independent test. That's not just winning, that's showing up to someone's house and absolutely demolishing them at their own game. At this point, you might be thinking, this sounds too good to be true. 650 horsepower, under 3 seconds to 60, beats Porsches at Nürburgring by 14 seconds, costs half as much. Where's the catch? Well, get comfortable, because the catch was spectacular. Remember that supercharger spinning at 20,000 RPM in a tight engine bay designed for both aerodynamics and pedestrian safety? Yeah, about that. The Z06 had a serious problem, heat soak. Under aggressive track driving, the LT4 would start cooking itself. Oil temperatures would spike, transmission temperatures would climb, and after 15 to 30 minutes of hard driving, the car would go into what owners called limp mode. Limp mode meant the car would dramatically cut power to protect itself from catastrophic failure. Imagine, you're at a track day. destroying Porsches and BMWs, feeling like a hero, and then suddenly your 650 horsepower weapon becomes a 650 horsepower disappointment. The car would reduce power by roughly 50%, leaving you limping back to the pits while the Europeans you were humiliating drove past, laughing in German. The problem was physics. That massive supercharger generated enormous heat, and the tight engine bay couldn't dissipate it fast enough. The 8-speed automatic transmission was particularly vulnerable. It shared cooling capacity with the engine and would overheat even faster than the manual. GM had built a car that was too fast for its own cooling system. The engineering equivalent of Icarus flying too close to the sun. Corvette forum exploded with complaints. Hundreds of pages of threads documented the problem. Owners who had spent $80,000 to humiliate Europeans were instead being humiliated at track days. The car that was supposed to prove American engineering could match Germany was instead proving that GM forgot about thermodynamics. Owners weren't just disappointed, they were furious. The frustration went legal. At least 4 class action lawsuits were filed against GM, including a major case called Matanke versus General Motors in federal court. Owners argued that GM had sold them a track-capable car that couldn't actually survive track conditions. The message was clear. If you're going to advertise Nürburgring lap times, the car should probably be able to complete more than a few laps without melting. GM's response was complicated. They initially downplayed the issue, then eventually issued a special coverage adjustment in December 2020. This wasn't quite a recall, but it acknowledged the problem existed. GM essentially admitted, yeah, we built a car so fast it couldn't cool itself. The settlement covered certain repairs, but for many owners, the trust was already broken. This is automotive tragedy in its purest form. GM built a car that was genuinely capable of embarrassing European exotics. The engineering was brilliant, the value was incredible. And then physics said, not so fast. The Z06 was Icarus. It flew higher than any American sports car before it, and then the heat brought it back down to earth. Poetic and devastating. But let's be fair. The Z06 was phenomenal for normal street driving. The heat problems only appeared under sustained track abuse. For 90% of owners who used it as a very fast street car with occasional spirited driving, the Z06 delivered everything it promised. 650 horsepower of American fury that made Porsche owners cry at stoplights. The C7 Z06 holds a bittersweet place in Corvette history. It was the last front-engine Z06. After 60-plus years of the engine sitting in front of the driver, the C8 would move it behind. The Z06 was the final evolution of a formula that started in 1953, and it was also the last Z06 to offer a manual transmission, the end of an era in more ways than one. GM produced the Z06 from 2015 through 2019, with the C8 taking over in 2020. Total production numbers across those years put it in the tens of thousands, making it relatively accessible compared to European limited editions. This wasn't a garage queen. It was a car GM expected people to actually drive, which made the cooling problems even more frustrating. Today, C7 Z06s are actually appreciating. Clean examples with the manual transmission and Z07 package are commanding premiums. The very car that frustrated owners with cooling problems is now being collected. Irony upon irony, the flawed hero is becoming a classic. The market has forgiven what physics could not. Let's compare to the Hellcat that started this story. The Hellcat had 707 horsepower, but weighed 4,400 pounds and wasn't exactly built for corners. The Z06 had 650 horsepower, but weighed 1,000 pounds less and pulled 1.2 Gs. The Hellcat was a sledgehammer. The Z06 was a scalpel. Both were valid approaches to American performance, but only one could chase Europeans through corners. The C7 Z06 teaches us something profound about engineering. You can have brilliant design, world-class performance, and incredible value, and still fail because you overlooked one fundamental problem. GM built a car that could beat the best in the world, and then watched it overheat trying to prove it. Sometimes, the enemy isn't the competition, it's the laws of thermodynamics. Despite the heat problems, the Z06 proved something important. America could build a car that competed with the best Europeans at a fraction of the price. Yes, it had flaws. Yes, owners were frustrated. But the core achievement was undeniable. GM showed that $79,000 could buy performance that previously required $200,000. The Z06 didn't just compete, it changed expectations. And speaking of changing expectations, next time, we're looking at what happens when an American manufacturer decides to stop competing and start dominating. A story of total commitment to one goal and the glory that followed. Subscribe so you don't miss it. So here's my question for you. Would you buy a car that could embarrass Ferraris but might overheat trying? Is the risk worth the reward? Or would you rather have something slower but reliable? Team Icarus or Team Safe? Fight about it in the comments. I'll be watching. If you want to see the European exotics that this $80,000 Corvette was hunting, check out Supercar Chronicles. We've covered the Porsches, Ferraris, and every exotic that woke up sweating when the Z06 was announced. Link in the description. Like, subscribe, and remember, this is Car Chronicles, where 650 horsepower meets the laws of thermodynamics.